morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for being part of WorkSafe's webinar, Improving Return to Work Outcomes for Mental Injuries, Secondary Mental Injuries and Support for Employers. My name is Fiona Shutt. I'm the Executive Director of Business Performance at WorkSafe Victoria, and I'm also your host for this morning's webinar. So thanks again for joining us. And while our program is virtual this year, we still have the same aims of Health and Safety Month, which is to keep you informed. And our theme this year is you learn something new every day. We've structured this session as a brief overview of insights, then a conversation between myself and the panel outlining support programs and resources available to employers to guide recovery and return to work outcomes for injured employers. We hope to outline this morning how you can learn more about your rights, responsibilities, and what support services are available to help. And with that, I'll introduce today's speakers. We have Lucas Kowalski, Manager, Return to Work Insurance from WorkSafe Victoria.
G'day, Fiona.
Good morning, Lucas. And we have Daniel Zayner, Group State Manager, Victoria and South Australia, Rehab Management. So welcome to you. Thanks, Daniel. So let's begin with some facts and figures to set the scene for this morning's chat. So in the year 2021, just over 13% of claims received by WorkSafe were for a workplace mental injury, which was slightly down on the year prior. But not all workplace injury claims resulted in the injured worker having time lost from work. Although the number of injured workers lodging claims for mental health injury declined year on year, there was a greater proportion requiring greater than 10 days off work, representing just over 70% of all mental injury claims received. So the story behind the numbers tells us that successful return to work programs have really never been more important, regardless of the injury type. So with that, I'll throw to our first speaker today, Lucas. Lucas joined WorkSafe in July 2018 after 10 years in various roles across claims management, return to work and customer service. At WorkSafe, Lucas collaborates closely with the Occupational Rehabilitation Provider Panel, as well as our agents on recovery and return to work support services for injured workers and their employers. So Lucas, could I start the first question with you today and ask, irrespective of the type of injury sustained, what are really the key fundamental actions that an employer should take after an injury has occurred in the workplace?
Thanks, Fiona. So the session is very much titled Mental Injury and Secondary Mental Injury, but as you've mentioned, there are some real key fundamentals that apply to any injury that's been sustained at work. So after the injured worker will complete a claim form. So they will provide that to the employer, and then the employer will have 10 calendar days to submit that to their agent. So it's a bit different for a primary mental injury claim, and that's 3 business days for Part A, and that's recently introduced from the 1st of July. Once the agent has received that claim form, the injured worker claim form, but also the claim form from the employer, they'll follow a standard claims process. But really, whilst the agent is working through that, we do encourage that the employer does remain in contact and does communicate with their injured worker whilst they're away from the workplace. As part of the obligations that employers have, they should be planning and consulting with respect to return to work, and that should really occur immediately once the injury has occurred. So there's an obligation to plan and consult, and that can occur every cycle of certificate, for example, and that should include taking stock of what suitable duties that injured worker could do once they do have the capacity for work, and also what they could offer as an employer. There are obligations for the injured worker as well, and they include participating in the return to work planning process and also communicating with the injured worker, but also with an occupational rehab provider as well. Something that we're definitely promoting across the scheme is engagement with the treating health practitioner, more commonly the GP. So as an employer, reaching out to the GP and seeking perhaps a case conference, that really does improve the recovery journey for the injured worker, and that would logically follow the return to work plan being prepared, and that would be provided to the GP and the injured worker as part of that case conference.
Thanks, Lucas. And do the same return to work principles apply to a physical injury as well as a mental injury, and can they be related?
Absolutely. So we define injury in two broad ways. So we've got a physical injury, which is then broken down into a musculoskeletal or MSD injury, and then also an other injury. So a fracture, for example, is an other injury, or a hernia. And then we have primary mental injuries, so anxiety, depression, PTSD, for example. There are nuances with both injuries insofar as communication and return to work planning, but the return to work planning process is inherently the same. I would say for a primary mental injury, the communication plan is a lot more important in setting those expectations very early on as to how you as the employer will communicate with that injured worker whilst they're off work, and really ensuring that that doesn't perhaps aggravate their injury and their illness, but also meets the expectations of that injured worker, but also your obligations as an employer. But fundamentally, the core return to work planning and engagement process is the same for both a physical injury and a primary mental injury as well.
Thanks, Lucas. And just staying with you in terms of process, and you made a comment in your earlier answer about how important it is for an employer to stay in touch and contact with an injured worker. So with that, once an employer prepares a return to work plan, is that sufficient enough in and of itself to progress return to work, or is there more to it?
As WorkSafe does provide some templates around return to work plans. So if an employer doesn't have anything prepared from there, and they're able to access a really good example of a return to work plan on our website. But as soon as the injury has occurred, it's important for the employer to fill that in, have a discussion with the injured worker, and that consultation is really important. Bring the injured worker into the process, include them in the planning process, and have a discussion about what they also think they could do as part of their return to work plan. A discussion with the THP or the GP, for example, is very important. The certificate of capacity that the injured worker will provide you as the employer is extremely important, because on that certificate is where the GP will outline the restrictions of the injured worker, and also what they can and can't do in the workplace. Providing that return to work plan, or even an offer of suitable employment, or even a position description to the GP, can help them really understand the functional requirements of the role that the injured worker will perform at work, to help them then inform the certificate, so that it gives the employer a lot more information to consider when they're planning. So return to work plan is important, but the consultation around that is a lot more important as well.
Thanks, Lucas. And clearly, the employer plays a critical role in the return to work process, as equally due to our agents, which I want to bring into the conversation now. How can an agent assist with the return to work planning process for a primary mental injury claim?
So once the claim has been received by an agent, there's a review that occurs at the very beginning. So each agent has a dedicated mental injury specialist, and that's something we introduced with our panel of agents in 2018. So the mental injury specialist will conduct a review of the claim, the circumstances, the information on file, either once it's been received or once it's been accepted. Part of that review is about establishing an earlier return to work and recovery, strategy and pathway for the injured worker, to really then inform what the case manager may do. So guiding the case manager as to what next steps. The case manager will then contact the injured worker, contact the employer as well once the claim has been accepted as well. But the mental injury specialist does play a key role, because they act as a support resource for the case manager. The mental injury specialist at each agent may also contact the injured worker. There are some claims that require that added level of tailored support and engagement, and that role is designed to offer that next level of clinical insight, and something that's really important. I spoke about it a little bit earlier on, a case conference. So the mental injury specialist can support the case manager in arranging a case conference that can occur with the GP. It could also occur with the treating health psychologist. It can include the employer as well. And it's about starting that process of bringing together the stakeholders to start thinking about the recovery and return to work journey for the injured worker.
And you talk about the important role of the mental injury specialists. Do they manage the claim from start to finish, or do they step in at certain points to bring certain groups together?
The majority of the work that the mental injury specialist will do will be from the very beginning, probably in the first 28 days, 6 weeks after the claim's been received. And they really act as that subject matter expert for the case manager, but also to step in on some of the more complex injuries and circumstances in the background of the claim. The majority of the engagement the injured worker will be between the case manager and themselves, but there is also an additional support by way of mobile case management. So again, it's another layer in the claims management support for the injured worker and the employer. current restrictions don't allow for our mobile case managers to go out face-to-face in metropolitan Melbourne at least, but the majority of the support offered by the MCM panel is to really go out, visit, be in a space that's safe for the injured worker and the employer, and to support that return to work process. So employers and injured workers can perhaps speak to their agent about additional support via the MCM program, which has been up and running since 2016 and it's been extremely successful. 14,000 workers have been supported over the last 4 years. So it's been very well received, both insofar as supporting return to work, but also improving the relationship between the injured worker, the agent, and also the employer as well.
Great, thanks for that, Lucas. And Lucas, we talk about the importance of employer needs or the employer's role as part of supporting this return to work program. If an employer finds that they need more support, specialist support, in assisting an injured worker back, what's available to them?
I think the way our scheme is structured, that there are claims that come in that can be managed by the employer and with support from the case manager at the agent, but there are also some circumstances where employers will need some additional allied health and some tailored support. And for that, we have a panel of occupational rehab providers in Victoria. So there are 24 providers approved by WorkSafe from the 1st of July this year, and I encourage the audience to go into our website and have a look at a profile of all our providers that we have on there. And the agent will refer to a provider where they identify that additional support is required. So the injured worker will choose from a list of 3, and then once they've chosen, a referral will be sent to that provider. So for a return to work with the pre-injury employer, the primary service is OES, Original Employer Services, and that can be both implemented for primary mental injury claims and physical injury claims as well.
Great, thanks, Lucas. And your mention of Original Employer Services is actually a great segue to bring Daniel into the conversation this morning. So over to you, Daniel. And just to give our viewers a bit of background on your role, Daniel, you are the Group State Manager for Victoria and South Australia at Rehab Management. You're an accredited exercise physiologist and have over 8 years' experience in workplace rehabilitation services delivery across a range of frameworks, and now oversee an operation of 70 team members managing 2,000 cases with physical and or mental injury. So quite a comprehensive role there, Daniel. So thank you for joining us as part of this morning's conversation. But if I can, I just wanted to throw to you to talk us through the role of an OES and how it plays out for you.
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. Thanks, Lucas, for providing some insights into some additional supports through OES. I guess I want to elaborate a bit further on OES so everyone joining can have a better understanding of what the service entails. I guess the ultimate purpose of OES is to assist an injured worker to achieve an early, safe and sustainable return to work with their pre-injury employer. And I guess the service actually supports employees also in information and coaching to well equip them to be able to continue independently manage the injured worker once they do achieve that full return to work and sustain that essentially. Now, it's important to note also that all OES services are delivered by an allied health professional, as Lucas mentioned. And primarily, I mean, if there's a primary mental injury claim, it should be assigned to a registered psychologist or someone with a psychology background. And if it's a physical claim, it would most likely be assigned to either an occupational therapist, a physio, or an exercise physiologist. And just to discuss exactly what it entails, essentially the allied health professional will arrange a meeting on site. So that'll be an initial assessment. And I guess ultimately at the initial assessment, the allied health professional will just get some contextual background as to how the injury occurred, what the limiting factors are, review their current medical capacity, and also administer a workplace assessment where essentially they will identify what the inherent requirements of the role is, or I guess what it entails, and identify any suitable duties that the injured worker could be doing in line with their current medical capacity or restrictions. From there, they will assist all parties with developing a return to work program and also include the treating health practitioner or the GP in collaboration with them as well, because ultimately the GP has to endorse it. And if it is endorsed, the allied health professional, the rehab consultant, will then continue to further support all parties and essentially the injured worker to progress with that return to work plan, grade them in, I guess, a progressive manner and a safe manner, and ultimately achieve that full return to work outcome.
Great. Thanks, Daniel. That's a great oversight. And with our focus on primary mental health injury as part of this morning's chat, do you find circumstances where there are many complex contributing factors to a primary mental health injury? And what support is available to work through those complexities?
Yeah, definitely. Look, I guess in my experience, I've come across a lot of complex factors that impact an injured worker's ability to make a safe and early return to work. And I guess one of the most common barriers that we see in our industry is, especially around mental injury, is a breakdown of relationship between the injured worker and, say, a colleague or a supervisor or even the employer, which is quite common, especially where there's bullying and harassment claims or just general anxiety disorder claims. And within the occupational rehab service model, there is a dedicated support stream that assists with primary mental injury, and that's called facilitated discussion. Facilitated discussion is a brief intervention for all claims where that breakdown of relationship is the main barrier stopping an injured worker from making a successful early return to work. And essentially the service model really is designed as a mediation service, and ultimately the aim of it is to resolve any of those breakdown of relationships and barriers and eventuate into an early return to work. Now, it's also important to note that anyone administering a facilitated discussion service is primarily an allied health professional, but also has additional qualifications in mediation and is registered and recognised by a mediation body or governing body as well. So there would be experienced consultants that deliver this service in and around mediation services. And finally, just to point out, all services and meetings, there is a lot of preparation that goes into it. Preferably the meetings or the mediation meetings do occur off-site, away from the work site, preferably maybe even at the occupational rehab provider's office. And essentially, the ultimate goal, like I mentioned, is that for all parties to reach a workable agreement so that we can assist with the worker making an early and safe return to work.
Excellent. Thanks, Daniel. So we've talked about the complexities, Daniel. We've talked about the supports available in terms of facilitated discussion, mediation, and other elements. I can imagine there would be circumstances where an employer may have exhausted all those options and may not been successful in getting an injured worker back to work. So what happens then?
Yeah, I guess good question. We would do everything we can to support an injured worker return to their pre-injury employer. However, there are circumstances where just, because of the nature of the injury or the lack of suitable duties or whatever it is over a long time where we've exhausted all options, it's just not possible anymore. And in that case, if the worker was to become job detached as a result of their injury, then we would lead into a service which is a primary service called NES. Now, there are three main services under NES, the first one being JSS or Job Seeking Services, and that's designed purely to assist an injured worker that is job detached to find new and meaningful employment in line with their current certified medical capacity. Say the injured worker doesn't have a current certified medical capacity by their GP, there is another service called CSS or Capacity Support Services, and that's a 6-week intervention where essentially the occupational rehab provider will come in and assist and collaborate with the treating health practitioners and I guess determine some transferable skills, some vocational options that are potentially going to be in line with their capacity, discuss that with the treating health practitioners, create an intervention that can potentially upgrade them towards those vocational options, and hopefully achieve a sign-off or a medical clearance so that they can then move into job seeking service or JSS, where again, really the aim of that is to then assist them with job brokerage, job seeking skills, and then hopefully would eventuate into a return to work placement into new and meaningful employment.
Excellent. Thanks, Daniel. And picking up on that theme, Lucas, I'm going to throw back to you. Could you tell us a bit more about the outcomes in using the new employer services and some of the elements that Daniel just described?
Absolutely. I think the call out is also that NES can support an injured worker at any point in time of a claim. It doesn't need to have to be early or late. When it's where it's required. So if it's identified very early on that a return to work can't occur at that employer for the health and safety or the well-being of that injured worker, or the relationship's broken down, for example, or even a physical injury, thinking about a physical injury that prevents that individual from doing, for example, labouring, the NES can be introduced very early on, and that's about the early intervention, early support as well. But what we do know is that the workers that do refer to NES and also find work, 60% find work earning at or above what they were earning before they were injured. And that's the ultimate goal, to return an injured worker back to meaningful work, and also work that they're quite proud of as well. In addition to just NES, there's also the retraining component. And this is something that we do encourage employers to even think about for injured workers for redeployment within their own business. So if there is an injured worker that has sustained an injury, but the employer can't find work for them or alternative light work within their own business, if there's another role that the worker may be suitable for but requires some additional training, the scheme can support that injured worker with that retraining. But for a lot of other circumstances, the injured worker may identify a particular role for as a goal, and then there's some training that needs to occur for them to be better positioned for that role. There's a retraining support offered through funding through our agents, and it's something that we do encourage injured workers to think about. And whilst they are participating in retraining, the occupational rehab provider will support them with things such as enrolment, commencing the retraining, and checking in throughout the early stages of commencing that retraining, because we acknowledge that a lot of injured workers sustain an injury, well into their career, and they may have not been through the training process for some time. So this is about not only funding the retraining, but also supporting them with that early stage of reintroduction into the schooling environment, for example.
Yeah, thanks for that, Lucas. And we've talked about, the investment in sort of medical support, occupational rehab, and the sort of the health or medical response to a mental health injury, but also equally as important is financial compensation and its timing to the employer that's injured and off work. So before you talk us through provisional payments, Lucas, and how they can support recovery and return to work for primary mental injury claims, I'd like to play a short video.
Having a mentally healthy workplace benefits everyone. Acting fast and supporting workers with mental injuries is important for your business. Your workers can now access free mental health support called provisional payments. It's quick, easy, and prevents an injury from worsening. You must let WorkSafe or your agent know as soon as your worker submits a mental injury claim. Early treatment of mental injury often provides better recovery and faster return to work results. It's important you understand your obligations for managing mental injury claims. Visit the WorkSafe website to learn more about mental health support for your workers.
So hopefully that clip provided our audience about a bit of context on provisional payments. But Lucas, can you talk us through how they work?
Absolutely. So from the 1st of July this year, so there was new legislation introduced in Victoria for injured workers and eligible volunteers, and they may be entitled to provisional payments. So what that is once an injured worker submits a claim for a mental injury or a claim with a mental injury component, the employer will have 3 business days to submit that to their agent, and that differs from the 10 days that is in the legislation for a physical injury. If the worker is entitled to provisional payments, the agent will make a decision at the very early onset about that, and then the injured worker will be entitled for up to 13 weeks of reasonable medical and like treatment for their claimed mental injury. The right treatment at the right time is extremely critical for recovery return to work. So what provisional payments does is bring a lot of that support forward, and it doesn't impact employer's premium, and the employer is also not liable for the first medical excess, and it's waived for these claims. If the claim isn't accepted for weekly compensation, which that assessment will still occur, the injured worker will be entitled to the reasonable medical and like and the weekly compensation entitlement component as well. If the agent does assess that claim after accepting it for provisional payments, but the decision is to deny ongoing weekly payment compensation, then the worker is still entitled for the first 13 weeks of medical and like services, and that also includes support by way of occupational rehab. So it's important that that is included where there is some requirement to assist with that return to work. Those early intervention programs to support that transition back to work, even at a reduced capacity, do make a real difference for the injured worker's wellbeing and recovery. So I think irrespective of whether or not a decision has been made by an agent, that early consultation and discussion with the worker is very important. But that's really provisional payments in a nutshell.
Thanks for that oversight, Lucas. And that brings us to the end of the more formal question part of the session. So I just want to thank Lucas and Daniel for their insights and context based on their experience thus far. But now gives us the opportunity to go to Q&A from the audience. And there's some great questions coming through. So thank you so much to our audience for tuning in and sort of putting some questions to us on what is such an important topic. So I'll open with the first question, and I'll direct this one to you, Lucas, because it's something you mentioned early on as part of your earlier answers about the ability to access specific support from doctors and health providers, especially in the current context of COVID and the restrictions in place. So it's a comment with a question. This person's experience is that doctors don't provide specific restrictions and can be uncooperative in returning calls or contacting employer return to works, etc. So I get the general sense that the question is, Lucas, how do we overcome a roadblock when we're looking to get someone back to work in a really supported way, but accessing the necessary health support to do that is not available?
It's a common question we're asked by employers when we meet with them. I think we always want to start with what has driven that provider to interact that way. So has something occurred in the past that has informed their opinion about engaging with an employer or an injured worker or an agent, which has then resulted in lack of engagement occurring? We try to encourage our agents, our OC Rehab panel, and even the work that we're doing with our clinical panel to reach out initially just to check in with a treating health practitioner, but without any intent to actually discuss something about the claim, because I think that can establish a relationship, and sometimes it can put someone offside if we just dive straight into a discussion about return to work without setting the context as well. So perhaps setting some pre-coms indicating that we're wanting to collaborate with the treater about that return to work, but also understand what support is required, because I think it needs to be about balancing the needs of both the employee but also the worker. WorkSafe as an organisation also has the clinical panel. So although employers can't access the clinical panel, they can speak to their agent. The agent can then request some support from our clinicians here at WorkSafe, and they can conduct a peer-to-peer contact with either the treater, the psychologist, the psychiatrist. So we have about 80 clinicians at WorkSafe of varying backgrounds, and that contact can then be made with the treater to discuss the barriers to communication and what expectations the treater has to then allow that open line of communication as well.
Great. Thanks for that, Lucas. And this one to yourself, Lucas, and invite you to participate in the response as well, Daniel, because there is a little bit of crossover. What action can be taken if an employee does not reasonably participate in the return to work program in order to sort of support their recovery and return to some sort of work, meaningful work?
Valid question. There are obligations in the Act on both the injured worker and the employer to participate, or the employer more so to plan and engage the injured worker to participate. We really need to understand why the driver behind the lack of participation. So again, very much with the treating health practitioner, understanding the drivers of that. So for example, has it been because they've received something that has probably upset them and they've decided to not engage, and that's obviously put them offside to some extent. I think it's important to explore all those factors. Has something occurred at home? Has their health deteriorated? And obviously, are they distracted in some of those ways? As a scheme, I think we have a responsibility to treat the whole person. So thinking about a physical injury, there's a component, for example, of secondary mental injury that is a driver of why someone can't return to work. And we need to treat both those barriers to return to work. So, for example, with a physical injury, we do find that an injured worker who is off work for a longer period of time may then start to feel mentally unwell, being away from the workplace, and that physical injury also impacting their home life. We need to explore that, because that may be a barrier as to why they're not engaging or participating, and start to introduce additional support to, I guess, encourage that. But even, I think Daniel spoke about it when referencing FD, creating a safe space. So meeting somewhere where the worker feels comfortable, but the employer feels comfortable. And I think the communication and the engagement really needs to be genuine, because I think at times it can then come across as being procedural. Once it's genuine, you've built that relationship, I think the trust can improve. I might throw to Daniel if he's got anything else to add.
Over to you, Daniel.
just briefly to add to that, I think that's where occupational rehab can really come into the picture to provide that additional, independent third-party support. And as Lucas mentioned, I guess we want to provide a holistic approach. We want to not only just focus and be so geared on the return to work outcome, but generally speaking, I mean, if we collaborate well with the treating parties and we collaborate well with the injured worker and relevant stakeholders and put together a holistic plan in place, essentially the ultimate focus is, once we improve their general well-being as a result of the physical or mental injury, as a result, that should eventuate into a return to work program.
Fantastic. Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, Lucas. And, some really interesting conversations and topics that we need to consider, in what are or were already complex return to work situations, but now in light of the impact of COVID as well. So I just wanted to thank both Lucas and Daniel for sharing their insights and their experience and that information with the audience this morning. We hope you found this conversation a lively one and an informative one. Returning to work from all sorts of workplace injuries is a really important topic, and an appreciation of the complexities that go with that is really critical to understand. So if you do need more information or any guidance or resources on any of the elements that we've talked about today, please do feel free to visit the WorkSafe website, where a range of reference information is available. Remember also, if you need some advice or if there's something you want to discuss urgently, there is the WorkSafe advisory line and emergency line. And as a note on the screen shortly is a list of all the contacts that we've talked about today as part of today's discussion. So I want to thank our speakers again. I want to thank our audience for joining us this morning and for the really great questions that came through to drive a really informative topic and conversation today. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.